Hi, friends of the planet. This is Miro. We are so excited today to have Dr. M. Sanjayan, the CEO of Conservation International, with us. And not only is he a world-renowned scientist, a leader of one of America's biggest and the world's biggest conservation organizations, but one of our oldest readers and one of our greatest friends of the planet. So Sanjayan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
And so the first question I wanted to ask is that environmental justice has become a very central focal point of the global conservation movement. And I wanted to ask, how does this relate to CI's work internationally and here?
It's a fantastic question, and it's a question very much rooted in the times that we live in. I will say I'm not sure it's so much of a focal point as it's definitely a topic of great discussion. So there's been a lot of talk, the actions are still a little bit lagging. You know, the thing that really shocked me, and I didn't really learn this till I was an adult, until I was fully engaged in conservation, not as a hobby, but as the way in which I'm going to try and contribute to the planet, was how little meritocracy there is in the environmental movement. That truly, truly surprised me. I think if you go and look at finance or you go and look at tech or medicine, they all have their moments. And this is the moment that the dialogue is really hitting the forefront. And all of these fields or sectors are really discussing the idea of inclusion, of diversity, of equity. Conservation has a long, long way to go. That really surprises me. And it surprises me for two reasons. One is that the folks who are most in the front lines of some of the biggest challenges we see today with the environment, whether it's climate change or the loss of fisheries or devastating forest fires or drought, or toxins or pollution, or even loss of biodiversity. The folks who are on the front lines of this tend to be people of color. They tend to be indigenous communities. They tend to be local people rooted in place. And yet the leadership or the majority of the organizations that are working on these challenges tend not to reflect that constituency. The other piece that is really surprising to me is, particularly coming from my spectrum of conservation, if you will. If you're trying to protect biodiversity, the majority of biodiversity is actually kind of in the global south. It's sort of in tropical countries. So anywhere between tropical Capricorn and tropical Cancer, that's the sort of sweet spot for the engine of life. Now, if you think about that, you think, well, that's, folks from Liberia and Colombia and Peru and Brazil and Costa Rica and Indonesia, again, lacking in terms of the leadership or the thinking. And this has a huge impact on our work. It's not just that it's unseemly and it's time to change. It fundamentally makes our mission less achievable because it builds something that ultimately the people who live there, the people who are living closest to the challenge and who in whose hands the solutions must rest, are excluded. And when they're excluded, the entire project design itself is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, that's such a great point, that this work really has to begin with the communities where it needs to be done. And it's so hard, I think, to figure out how to be as inclusive as possible when you're also trying to work with big banks who haven't always worked with these communities. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about nature-based solutions and really dig into something that Conservation International is so focused on. How is that helping diverse and indigenous communities? And how do you think you can get some of the biggest, most powerful institutions in the world to pay attention to these issues now?
Great question, Monica. Do you ever wish that you were there the first few years when Amazon was a tiny little company selling books? I remember that as a first ordering books from Amazon. And you think about the explosive rise of that company and that stock, right? You always wait for that moment where you had the chance and make a difference kind of early on so that you can ride the wave. In my lifetime, and I'm pretty sure in our lifetimes, we've never seen that in conservation. Our game has always been desperately incremental.
I hope it's now, don't you?
Yes, that's exactly what I think. I think we're actually on the cusp of one of those gigantic waves that finally is coming to conservation. We, all three of us, we all knew in our bones that nature had value, that this meant something, that this is why we're going to devote our lives to it. The world is finally catching up. Business has finally caught up. Governments are now coming online as well and are catching up, right? So you're finally seeing this tsunami of interest, of money, of funding, of interest. But the big challenge is it once again going to exclude those who are most in that front line? So the guardians of this nature-based solution. So the simple way of thinking of nature-based solutions is like, planet has a ton of carbon that is trapped in trees. and mangroves and ecosystems, carbon-dense ecosystems. If we release all of that into the atmosphere by burning a forest or destroying land, ultimately, there's no way in God's green earth we're ever going to get to anything resembling the Paris Climate Agreement. So it is imperative we first protect it and then help to heal and restore it. That's what nature-based solutions for climate is really all about. The world is finally understanding that nature has way more value alive and thriving than dead and burnt. There's a way to monetize that, which means we're going to move away from just philanthropy as the way to save biodiversity, to save nature, to save forests, and really bring in the engines of finance to bear. Mark Carney, who you know as well, just a couple of days ago on a World Economic Forum thing, said something amazing. He said it's like, in his mind, it's the biggest, form of cross-border funding that he has ever seen. And it's true. I mean, I don't think we'll ever see something like this in our lifetimes. I am determined that Conservation International, but all the conservation groups, adequately steward this and shape the wave that is coming and make sure that the people who are on the front lines of conservation, who can actually protect this carbon, benefit from it.
Yeah, I think it's such an amazing thing that President Biden actually latched onto the Amazon as a place to talk about this very thing, because it's something everybody can kind of relate to. They know what it means when you say we have to save the Amazon. They get it. So hopefully we can find more of those places and make them well known to people so they'll feel that pull for lots of beautiful and incredible and important places around the world.
President Biden, when he was, I think in one of his debates, I think the first debate, one of the things that really stood out was he specifically mentioned the Amazon. I was like thinking, oh my God, pinch me. Like, I've been waiting for this moment when the potential at that time president of the United States is saying protect the Amazon, because it means not just protecting the Amazon, but basically saving all our lives, right? And now when you look at his executive order, it says Amazon, it says other carbon-rich ecosystems. So we put out a map last year that's published in peer-reviewed scientific literature that lays out the most carbon-dense places around the world. And it kind of is like the treasure map to our future. And if we can invest in those places and the communities that are guarding or stewarding these places, I think we have a much better shot of meeting our targets under Paris Climate Agreement.
So I wanted to dive a little deeper on a theme that I've heard brought up a couple times in our conversation, in that how much people at the top affect policy and culture, whether it's the President of the United States or leaders of environmental organizations. And Sanjayan, you're one of the only non-white CEOs of a major environmental organization. And I wanted to ask, how does your background drive the way that you lead CI?
So it's a really great question. I've really never thought of it in those terms. And I have to admit that even in my career, there have been several positions that I've applied for where I've thought I'm perfectly capable of doing it. Where I've been told occasionally in these exact words that I'm not the right fit. And then when I look at who got the jobs, it became apparent clear what that actually meant. And even with this job that I have now, and I'm deeply grateful to the board and our founder for giving me this opportunity to help lead this organization, I wasn't sure that was the decision even a few days before, 3.5 years ago, the board appointed me as CEO. I know how tricky and difficult it is to make that leap. From my perspective, I think it's done two things. Look, I was born in Sri Lanka. I'm a minority in my own country. My family left when I was 5 because of civil unrest. And we didn't come to America. We went to Africa. And we didn't just go, Cape Town. We went to Sierra Leone. And we went to the jungle 200 miles from the capital city in a little town called Kenema, which really is one of those places that later on emerges as one of those spots where the West African Ebola crisis really emerges from. So my formative childhood was in Africa and in Asia, in Sierra Leone, in Sudan, in Kenya. My parents lived for a while in Pakistan. The thing that I learned most about living there and seeing the world through the eyes of the folks around me was that the people there really did want to protect nature. They do understand the value of nature. And just the language they were using to describe what they were trying to do was a language of value. Whereas for me, it tended to be a language of love. So when I would say, I love this tree and love this forest, I'm not suggesting that someone in West Africa wouldn't say that. But most often, the words that would come out would have something to do with how important that tree was or that forest was to their economy or their community. It was a language of value. It opened in my eyes this realization that if we're trying to make conservation happen, particularly in faraway places from where we live, ultimately it has to be in I'm using the words of our founder, the enlightened self-interest of people to make it really stick. That philanthropy that we all rely on should only be the grease, the initial driver. But if you really want conservation to stay its course, it has to be self-perpetuating. It has to have some built-in mechanism to make sure it continues to last. Imagine someone trying to come and bulldoze over Central Park today and put up a building. Can you imagine the hue and cry that would come from all the landowners around there? Because they get the value of it. That kind of valuation is what we need to build into conservation. That is, I think, a perspective that is prevalent in the global South.
So fascinating how you've described that, because I think it is at the essence of the thing we were talking about before, which is nature-based solutions. This isn't nature for some esoteric spiritual value. It's nature because it has value. And now our economists are kind of figuring that out after so long of thinking, those things didn't have any other value than that spiritual.
I returned to Sierra Leone in 2016 after the Civil War. And I went back to the sort of villages that I grew up in. And I walked into a village and I saw a group of kids basically roasting a monkey over a fire. Now, it's not an endangered species. It's a common sort of monkey that you find, agricultural forest edge monkey. What shocked me about that moment is that the kids were using a little piece of metal like this, like a metal sheet, to fan the flames like this, right? And on that metal sheet, which they'd cut from some sign on the side of the road, were the words WFP, World Food Program, in blue with the blue wreaths on it. And I have a photo of this, and it struck me like a lightning bolt that, think about this. These kids were using the World Food Program sign in order to fan the flames of a fire that was actually roasting the monkey, which is what they were going to eat. At the end of the day, when social nets fray, when society collapses, when civil war intervenes, when governments cannot provide for their people, guess what still stands up and provides? Nature. It's the ultimate social safety net for everyone, for us. Whether you're in Flint, Michigan, or you live here on the edge of Washington, D.C., and it's my respite from COVID, or you live in West Africa and you're dependent on it for food, for fuel, for fresh water, for fisheries.
It connects all of us. It's so powerful and it's so valuable. Let me ask you this as sort of a second challenging question. How do you think you can improve the ranks of CI and lots of other environmental organizations by example or by your leadership in terms of diversity within their ranks? How can we get more young Sanjans into CI and all the other organizations to help do this great work?
There are some amazing people out there and I meet them all the time. We just hired this amazing young guy by the name of Calvin Alley. He's from the Dominican Republic. A guy of African heritage, or he would identify himself as Black, smart, talented, rose up through the ranks really with like himself, like from a very sort of entry-level position to a very, very senior position at another organization. We're lucky enough to bring him on board. So there are amazing people I meet all the time, as both of you do as well. I think the second part of your question is much harder to answer, and that is, how do we really spur the kind of conversation and a movement that can lift everyone up, and other organizations as well? And the reason that is difficult is that it's difficult to speak out without sounding like you're criticizing. I'll be honest, like all the CEOs of all the big conservation groups are friendly with me, and some of them are real close friends. And so you have to be mindful about how you provide the guidance and the encouragement that you do. But it is time for us to speak up, and we want more people to speak up. For our own organization, from the moment I've come in, this has been on my agenda, but it's not something that I have felt comfortable necessarily taking on. I'll be completely honest with you, because you almost expect that the CEO who's not white to come in with kind of that agenda. And in some ways, I was a coward not to be more forceful about it. What has happened over the last year or so in terms of Black Lives Movement and in terms of the conversation that's happening in this country now has to some extent given me permission to speak up a bit more and push a bit more. We have an amazing person who's our Chief People Officer, a woman who is well-versed and thoughtful and a fantastic guide to where we want to go. And so Kim has been kind of my right-hand person in navigating this journey of thinking about our own organization. So let me tell you some things that are concrete. I'll tell you what's really concrete at CI. The board now wants us to report on diversity, equity, and inclusion at every single board meeting. And it's really the top 1, 2, 3 topics that are covered by me and by our Chief People Officer in laying out where we are in the progress towards it. Kim has done an incredible job at CI as our Chief People Officer, putting in place a series of very thoughtful steps in order to make our own organization better. That's as simple as that, just to make our organization better. I have focused effort on my board. As you know, finding board members, particularly, or finding good board members is just hard. It's just the hardest thing, one of the hardest things that I have to do. It's harder to do during lockdown and when you can't meet people face to face. But it's something that we started actually 3 years ago. Actually, probably even longer than that. From the day I've been at CI, how that board transitions and becomes more diverse and becomes more, reflects different fields, different ideologies, different races, nationalities has been incredibly important to me. So today we have 3 board members who would identify as Black. One who is an African woman, originally from Chad French citizenship, Hindu Ibrahim, who is just terrific, and a great voice for Indigenous people. Lisa Jackson, who many of you know, was the head of the EPA under President Obama, now runs policy and environmental stewardship for Apple, is on our board and is just amazing and a great, great mentor in some ways, not only on this topic, but many topics as well.
We
and
love
then
Lisa.
Idris came on board about a year ago, just before the lockdown. And Idris Elba has been fantastic as well. He's truly a global guy. You cannot pigeonhole that guy in because he's sort of American, but he's British. One parent is from Ghana, the other's from Sierra Leone, but he was born in the UK. His wife is Somali Canadian, Sabrina. So they bring a whole level of like cool factor, but also just unbelievable global presence that he has. So those voices have been very important on the board. Diversity, equity, and inclusion now has a home within the board. And interestingly, where we put it is in our compensation committee. That's a piece of advice I would give to many other colleagues of mine. The compensation committee turns out to be a really important committee, particularly at CI, because so many of the executive pay is linked to performance. Right? It's actually linked to performance. By putting diversity, equity, and inclusion in that, it absolutely makes it clear that we're going to reward the organization's leaders for incorporating, for thinking about, for leading on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those are some of the things that we've done. We're also a bit lucky. I'll be honest with you, right? So because we work outside, primarily outside the United States, around the world, our countries tend to be led by country nationals. And our regions tend to be led by nationals from that region as well. So our Asia division is led by an Asian. Our Africa division is led by an African, a Black African from Nigeria who's leading our Africa work, based out of Kenya. Our Americas work is led by a Brazilian woman. Our oceans work is led by a Polynesian woman. We have a little bit of help. I think the amount of catching up that other organizations need to do who are more US based or perhaps purely European based is greater than the amount of work that we at CI need to do. But we don't want to say or consider ourselves not part of the challenge here. We want to lead as much as we can.
And I wanted to end looking ahead a bit, because as you mentioned earlier, this past year, we've really seen that the environmental movement as a whole really has had kind of, I don't want to say a change of heart, but a lot of our eyes have been open to the fact that there is no racial justice without environmental justice. And within the broader movement, environmental justice issues have become really central. And we see that as President Biden has now taken office and has prioritized these issues as well. So I wanted to ask, what do you think the next couple of years will look like now that there is an increased awareness about the disproportionate effect of climate and pollution on non-white communities?
I think that we have the opportunity to be a movement rather than a niche. For the longest time, my family could not understand actually what I do. And it was sort of like my hobby, right?
I think we've all had that issue working in this world.
My hobby. And you really understand that. You think about this, you do these polls and you find out that everyone cares about the environment. It ranks very high up there. They don't tend to vote on it.
Right.
You don't have to really actually spend on it either, right? So you sort of say, well, how is it possible that we will devote our entire lives to it and clearly don't see this as a hobby, but so many other people will see it as something nice to have, but not crucial? And the reason is I think we've always thought about it as a niche. We have unfortunately perpetuated that myth of the lonely guy wearing fleece with a cool dog on the top of a peak alone, which is not how most people of color actually experience the environment. When we go out, you ever go see an Asian family in the park? It is loud. Like, that's the whole family. There's food, there's music. It's just different. It's not worse or better. It's just different, right? So I think we have this real opportunity to be part of a movement rather than a part of a niche. And I love that. That means also losing some control. That means being a little uncomfortable. That means seeing other leaders you've never heard of all of a sudden emerge on the front lines and stage. So, it's going to take that. So I'm very optimistic that we finally have the voice and the votes and the spending power to actually ask, demand for action. Never forget that it's rare that governments actually can lead. Governments nearly always follow. It looks like leadership, but it's actually sort of followership. It's just the whole system is set up that way. And if you think about it, the reason why you're seeing some of the movement you're seeing, not just in this country, but around the world, is because people were making their voices heard. Businesses get this. The thing that had blown me away last year during lockdown was that even when governments had paused, businesses stayed the course, because they can sort of see that if you want to be a business that is built to last, you have to be thinking about who is purchasing your products. How do you scale? When you think about the customer, you think about the data. I've been buoyed by the fact that businesses and led, people are now exerting their voice, linking up. You're completely right. Climate justice, environmental justice, conservation, these are linked. These are absolutely linked. And that linkage just makes us stronger, even though at times it might make us uncomfortable.
Sanjayan, that was so well put. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk with you. I cannot thank you enough for your leadership and for sharing your views with us today. And we are on that journey with you. We really hope to help increase the conversation on all these topics and build this movement together with leaders like you. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being such a great friend of the planet too. We really appreciate it.
You both as well in our Daily Planet. Keep getting that out there. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.